The woman who sweated rot, the curse that made the body decay while still alive in the Appalachians. Deep in the forgotten hollows of rural Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient mountains like secrets too heavy to carry, there existed a family whose bloodline had turned against itself. This is the story of Marianne Coulter, a woman whose flesh began to deteriorate while her heart still beat, a living nightmare born from generations of forbidden unions in one of America's most isolated communities. Her tragedy would expose a darkness that had festered for over a century in the shadow of those timeless peaks. The year was 1973. Harlan County, Kentucky, was a place where roads ended and suspicion began, where families had lived on the same rocky soil since before the Civil War, and where outsiders were met with silent stares and locked doors. The Coulter family had occupied a remote valley called Blackwater Hollow for 5 generations, their ramshackle homestead invisible from any main road, accessible only by a treacherous dirt path that wound through dense forest and crossed 3 unnamed creeks. Neighbors spoke of the Coulters in hushed tones, if they spoke of them at all. Some claimed the family was cursed, others said they were simply the inevitable result of mountain people who kept too much to themselves. Marianne was born in the spring of 1954 to Ezekiel and Ruth Coulter, though the true nature of her parentage would not be understood until much later. She was the youngest of 7 children, all born in the same weathered cabin that had housed Coulters since 1870. The family rarely ventured into town, perhaps once every few months, for supplies they could not grow or make themselves. They had no electricity until 1968, no telephone ever. The children were educated at home by their mother, who herself had received only a 3rd-grade education. Their world was contained within the boundaries of their 60-acre plot, a kingdom of poverty and isolation where the outside world seemed as distant as the moon. From early childhood, Marianne was different. Her siblings were thin and pale, as mountain children often were, but reasonably healthy. Marianne, however, suffered from persistent ailments that her mother treated with folk remedies and prayers. She had weak bones that fractured easily, teeth that grew in crooked and rotted young, and skin that bruised at the slightest touch. Her eyes, a pale, watery blue, seemed to focus with difficulty, giving her a perpetual expression of confusion. By age 10, she had suffered 3 broken arms, 2 broken legs, and countless sprains. Her father, a stern man weathered by coal dust and hardship, attributed her fragility to a weak spirit. Her mother, more superstitious, believed the girl carried the weight of ancestral sins. The Coulter family tree, had anyone bothered to document it properly, would have revealed a disturbing pattern. Ezekiel Coulter's grandparents were first cousins who had married in 1892. Their children, including Ezekiel's father Abraham, had married within a network of 3 interconnected families who shared the hollow. Families who themselves were already related through previous generations of intermarriage. By the time Ezekiel was born in 1928, the Coulter bloodline had been Xunhuan, folded back upon itself so many times that genetic diversity had all but vanished. When Ezekiel married Ruth in 1946, he was marrying his second cousin, though neither could have articulated the precise nature of their relation. They knew only that they were kin, as everyone in Blackwater Hollow was kin in one way or another. This centuries-long pattern of consanguinity had consequences that manifested in every generation. Infant mortality was high, with nearly half of all babies born in the hollow dying before their first birthday. Those who survived often bore the marks of genetic degradation: club feet, cleft palates, profound deafness, intellectual disabilities of varying severity. The Coulter family had buried 11 children who had not lived past infancy. The 7 who survived, including Marianne, were considered blessed by their parents, evidence of God's mercy. They did not understand that they were looking at genetic catastrophe in slow motion, a biological time bomb that had been ticking for generations and was now approaching detonation. Marianne's teenage years were marked by increasing physical deterioration. By age 15, she had lost most of her teeth, her gums chronically infected and bleeding. Her hair, once a mousy brown, had become brittle and patchy, falling out in clumps that left bare spots across her scalp. She developed a persistent body odor that no amount of washing could eliminate, a sour, rotten smell that her siblings tormented her about. Her father beat her for her hygiene, believing she was lazy and unclean. Her mother made her sleep in the barn during the worst episodes, unable to bear the stench in the house. Marianne endured these humiliations in silence, withdrawing into herself, becoming a ghost in her own family. In the autumn of 1970, when Marianne was 16, something shifted. She began experiencing episodes of fever that would spike suddenly, drenching her in sweat that stained her clothing yellow-brown. The sweat itself had a viscous quality, thicker than normal perspiration, and it carried that same putrid odor that had plagued her for years, now intensified to an almost unbearable degree. Within days of these episodes beginning, her mother noticed something horrifying. The skin, where Marianne had sweated most profusely, appeared to be breaking down, developing patches of discoloration that looked like bruises, but felt soft to the touch, almost mushy beneath the surface. When Ruth pressed on one of these patches on Marianne's shoulder, her finger sank in slightly, and Marianne screamed in agony. Terrified, Ruth finally convinced Ezekiel to take their daughter to see Dr. Morrison in the town of Harlan, nearly 30 miles away. It was only the second time Marianne had seen a doctor in her life, the first being when she was 8 and had broken her femur so badly the bone had pierced the skin. Dr. Morrison, an elderly physician who had practiced in the county for 40 years and had seen his share of the physical toll of poverty and poor genetics, was nonetheless shocked by what he observed. The girl sitting before him looked decades older than her 16 years. Her skin hung loose on her frame, marked by the strange, softening lesions her mother had described. Her remaining teeth were black stumps. Her eyes were clouded with early cataracts. Most disturbing were the weeping sores on her arms and torso, places where the skin had apparently liquefied and sloughed away, leaving raw, infected wounds that produced a discharge unlike anything in his medical experience. Dr. Morrison admitted Marianne to the small county hospital, where she spent 3 weeks undergoing every test the rural facility could perform. Blood work revealed severe anemia, kidney malfunction, and liver enzyme levels that suggested advanced organ damage. X-rays showed bones with the density of someone in their 70s, riddled with microfractures and areas of abnormal softening. The mystery of her condition deepened when cultures taken from her wounds grew bacteria that the lab could not definitively identify, organisms that seemed to thrive in the necrotic tissue. The word that kept appearing in the medical notes was necrosis, the death of living tissue. Somehow, in localized areas across her body, Marianne's flesh was dying while she remained alive. It was a visiting specialist from the University of Kentucky Medical Center who finally began to piece together the puzzle. Dr. Helena Vargas, a geneticist conducting research on inherited disorders in Appalachian populations, heard about the unusual case and requested permission to examine Marianne. During her evaluation, Dr. Vargas asked detailed questions about family history, questions that made Ezekiel and Ruth uncomfortable. When Dr. Vargas delicately inquired about whether there was any close kinship in the family tree, Ruth initially denied it, shame and defensiveness rising in her voice. But as Dr. Vargas explained that she was not there to judge, but to understand, Ruth slowly began to reveal the truth about the marriages within Blackwater Hollow. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque aqui você vai descobrir as histórias mais chocantes e ocultas que a humanidade tentou enterrar, mas que precisam ser contadas. Dr. Vargas spent 2 full days documenting the Coulter family history, creating the first comprehensive genealogical chart of the Blackwater Hollow families. What emerged was a genetic nightmare of such magnitude that she would later call it one of the most extreme cases of consanguinity she had ever encountered outside of historical isolated populations. The coefficient of inbreeding in Marianne's generation, a measure of genetic similarity, was extraordinarily high, comparable to that of children born from sibling or parent-child pairings, though technically her parents were second cousins. But the cumulative effect of 5 generations of repeated cousin marriages within the same small gene pool had produced genetic compression that mimicked much closer relationships. The implications were staggering. Marianne was suffering from a constellation of genetic disorders, each individually rare, but appearing together because harmful recessive genes had been given repeated opportunities to pair up over generations. Her skeletal fragility was likely a form of osteogenesis imperfecta, her dental problems related to amelogenesis imperfecta, and her immune dysfunction possibly tied to a rare primary immunodeficiency disorder. But the tissue necrosis, the rotting of living flesh, was the most puzzling piece. Dr. Vargas theorized that Marianne had inherited a mutation affecting collagen synthesis and tissue repair, causing her skin and connective tissue to break down under the metabolic stress of her other conditions. The fever episodes were her immune system, attempting to fight infections that her body was creating within itself. Infections breeding in tissue that was essentially composting while still attached to her living frame. The medical team attempted treatment, but the damage was too extensive and multifaceted. Antibiotics would temporarily clear infections, only to have them return within days. The necrotic patches continued to spread, appearing now on her legs, her back, her face. The hospital staff, despite their professionalism, struggled with the psychological impact of caring for a young woman who was quite literally decomposing. The smell of decay hung in her room, despite constant cleaning and air circulation. Marianne herself retreated into near-total silence, her mind seemingly unable to process the horror of what was happening to her body. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, simply lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling, tears occasionally running down her hollow cheeks. After 6 weeks, with no improvement and her condition actively deteriorating, the hospital informed the Coulter family that there was nothing more they could do. Marianne was dying, and she would likely be more comfortable at home. Ezekiel, financially ruined by the medical bills and emotionally shattered by the revelation of how his family's isolation had created this tragedy, brought his daughter back to Blackwater Hollow. She lasted another 4 months. By the end, according to her sister Sarah, who cared for her in those final weeks, nearly 40% of Marianne's skin surface had succumbed to the necrotic process. She died on March 7, 1971, officially from septic shock and organ failure, but really from the accumulated weight of 100 years of genetic self-destruction. The tragedy of Marianne Coulter sent shockwaves through the medical and social services communities in eastern Kentucky. Dr. Vargas published a case study in a medical journal, carefully anonymized, that became a landmark paper on the dangers of prolonged genetic isolation. Social workers descended on Blackwater Hollow and surrounding communities, conducting health screenings and genetic counseling, though they were met with suspicion and often outright hostility by residents who viewed this as government interference in their way of life. The Coulter family itself largely dispersed. Ezekiel died less than a year after Marianne, some said from a broken heart, others from liver failure related to increased drinking. Ruth moved in with relatives in Virginia and never spoke of her daughter again. The cabin in Blackwater Hollow was abandoned and eventually collapsed, reclaimed by the forest. But Marianne's story did not end with her death. In the decades that followed, researchers continued to study the genetic legacy of Appalachian isolation. They found that Blackwater Hollow was far from unique. Across the mountain regions of Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and Tennessee, there existed pockets of extreme isolation where similar patterns of consanguinity had produced similar results. The medical literature began documenting cases of rare genetic disorders appearing at rates hundreds of times higher than in the general population. Entire families afflicted by conditions so rare they had never been properly named. Some communities had average lifespans 20 years below the national average. Infant mortality rates rivaled those of developing nations. The scientific explanation for what happened to Marianne and countless others like her lies in the merciless mathematics of genetics. Every human carries approximately 2 copies of each gene, one from each parent. Some of these genes contain mutations that, when paired with a matching mutated gene, cause disease or dysfunction. In large, diverse populations, the chances of 2 people with the same rare mutation meeting and having children are minimal. But in isolated populations where everyone is related, those chances skyrocket. When cousins marry, they share a significant portion of their genetic material inherited from their common grandparents. Their children thus have much higher chances of inheriting 2 copies of any harmful mutations that run in the family line. Repeat this process over multiple generations, and the effects compound exponentially. The Coulter family had been doing exactly this for 5 generations. Every marriage brought together people who were already significantly related, concentrating genetic mutations that in a normal population would remain harmlessly hidden. By the time Marianne was conceived, her parents shared so much genetic material that large portions of her genome were effectively homozygous, meaning she had inherited identical or near-identical genes from both parents. This homozygosity unmasked every genetic flaw that had been lurking in the Coulter bloodline, and she paid the price in suffering beyond imagination. The social factors that enabled such extreme consanguinity are complex and rooted in the unique history of Appalachia. The families that settled in these remote hollows in the 1800s were often fleeing something: debt, law, conflict, or simply seeking isolation from a world they found threatening. The mountains provided refuge but also imposed harsh limitations. Communities were separated by geography that made travel difficult and dangerous. Cultural attitudes emphasized self-sufficiency and suspicion of outsiders. Poverty meant that young people had little opportunity to travel or meet potential partners outside their immediate area. Religious beliefs sometimes reinforced the idea that marrying within the community kept the faith pure. Over time, these factors created genetic islands, populations that might as well have been on remote ocean islands for all the genetic exchange they had with the outside world. By the late 20th century, improved roads, mandatory education, and economic pressures that drove young people to seek work in cities began to break down these isolated communities. The genetic consequences, however, remained. Today, genetic counselors in Appalachian regions still encounter families dealing with the legacy of consanguinity. Testing can now identify carriers of specific mutations before they have children, allowing informed decisions that previous generations never had access to. But the cultural sensitivity required in these situations is immense. Many families feel judged, stigmatized as backward or ignorant, when in reality they are victims of circumstances largely beyond their control, inheritors of decisions made by ancestors who had no understanding of genetics. Marianne Coulter's case became a teaching tool in medical schools, an example of how social isolation can have biological consequences as devastating as any infectious disease. Her photograph, taken during her hospital stay and included in Dr. Vargas's research with family permission, showed a young woman who looked ancient, her body betraying the genetic load it carried. Students who saw that image never forgot it. It became a powerful illustration of why genetic diversity matters, why populations benefit from genetic exchange, why isolation, whether geographic or cultural, can exact a terrible price. The ethical questions raised by Marianne's story continue to resonate. Should authorities intervene in isolated communities to prevent consanguineous marriages? Most experts say no, that education and access to genetic counseling are more ethical approaches than prohibition, which historically has often targeted already marginalized communities. Should such extreme cases be publicized to educate the public, or does that unfairly stigmatize affected families and regions? The balance between public health and personal dignity remains delicate. What responsibility does society have to address the health disparities in isolated populations? These questions have no easy answers, but Marianne's suffering demands that we ask them. In the years following Marianne's death, Sarah Coulter, her older sister, became an unlikely advocate for genetic awareness in rural communities. Sarah, who had been spared the worst of the genetic inheritance, moved to Lexington and worked with public health organizations to develop culturally sensitive educational materials about the risks of close kinship marriages. She spoke publicly about her sister's death, bearing witness to the tragedy in hopes that other families might avoid similar outcomes. Sarah faced criticism from some who felt she was betraying her heritage and airing shameful family secrets. But she persisted, driven by memories of her sister's final months, the smell of decay that filled their childhood home, the look of betrayal in Marianne's eyes as her own body turned against her. Now take a moment and think about Marianne's final days. Imagine being 16 years old and watching your own flesh rot away while you're still conscious, still feeling everything. Think about that. And if this story has moved you, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on how isolation and lack of knowledge can destroy lives. The Blackwater Hollow Valley today is barely recognizable. The few families who remain have intermarried with outsiders or moved away. The old cabin sites are marked only by stone foundations and the occasional rusted implement. Nature has reclaimed what isolation once held. But locals still speak of the valley with a certain wariness, as if the genetic tragedy that unfolded there left some stain upon the land itself. Hikers who venture into the area report an odd feeling of sadness, though whether this is the power of suggestion or something more ineffable is impossible to say. The medical records from Marianne's case remain in research archives, anonymized but preserved. Every few years, a new generation of geneticists rediscovers them and is struck by the severity of what unfettered consanguinity can produce. The particular combination of disorders she exhibited, the synergistic way they compounded each other's effects, represents a worst-case scenario of recessive genetic disease. In scientific terms, she was exceptionally unlucky, having inherited the worst possible combinations from an already compromised gene pool. In human terms, she was a young woman who never had a chance, born into a body programmed from conception to fail, her suffering predetermined by choices made generations before her birth. Dr. Vargas, now in her 80s and retired from active research, still considers Marianne's case the most heartbreaking of her long career. In interviews, she emphasizes that the Coulter family were not villains or ignorant people deserving of scorn. They were simply victims of geography, poverty, and lack of access to information that was not widely available until recent decades. The concept of genetic risk from consanguinity was not well understood even in medical communities until the mid-20th century. For isolated rural families with limited education, it was not understood at all. They married within their communities because that was what their parents had done and their grandparents before them. They could not see the invisible accumulation of genetic damage until it manifested in children like Marianne, and by then it was too late. The broader implications of the Coulter story extend beyond Appalachia. Similar patterns of consanguinity and genetic isolation have occurred in communities around the world. Isolated island populations, religious communities that married only within the faith, royal families that married to preserve bloodlines, geographic isolates in mountain or desert regions. The results are consistently tragic when populations fall below certain thresholds of genetic diversity. The minimum viable population for long-term genetic health is larger than most people realize, typically requiring hundreds of unrelated individuals to maintain sufficient diversity. Communities like Blackwater Hollow, with perhaps 50 people total, descended from 3 original families, were doomed from a genetic standpoint from the beginning. Modern genetics can now quantify these risks with precision that would have seemed like science fiction in Marianne's time. Genetic testing before conception can identify couples at high risk of having children with specific genetic disorders. Prenatal testing can detect many conditions early in pregnancy. These technologies raise their own ethical questions about what level of genetic risk is acceptable, what conditions justify intervention, and who decides these questions. But they also offer opportunities that Marianne's generation never had. The opportunity to make informed choices, to understand the risks, to break cycles of genetic damage that have persisted for generations. The cultural legacy of genetic isolation in Appalachia is complex and often painful. The region has been stereotyped and mocked, its people portrayed as ignorant and backward, their genetic problems presented as evidence of inferior stock. This prejudice ignores the historical factors that created these isolated communities and the resilience and dignity of the people who lived in them. It also obscures the fact that genetic disorders caused by consanguinity are found in every human population, not unique to any region or culture. What made Appalachian cases more visible was the concentration caused by isolation, not any inherent difference in the people themselves. Breaking down these stereotypes while honestly addressing the public health implications of consanguinity remains a challenge for educators and advocates. Marianne's grave is in a small family cemetery on a hillside above what used to be Blackwater Hollow. The headstone is simple, giving only her name and dates. There is no mention of how she died or what she suffered. Sarah visits occasionally, bringing wildflowers in the summer, clearing away the encroaching vegetation. She is now the last living person who remembers Marianne, who can testify to the reality of her sister's suffering. When Sarah is gone, Marianne will exist only in medical records and anonymized case studies. A data point illustrating the dangers of genetic isolation, her humanity reduced to a teaching tool. Perhaps that is as it should be, if her story can prevent others from suffering the same fate. But it seems a cruel, final indignity for a young woman who endured so much and received so little mercy from the genetic lottery of her birth. The phenomenon of tissue necrosis in living patients, the specific condition that made Marianne's case so horrifying, remains poorly understood even today. While necrosis is common in cases of severe infection, injury, or vascular disease, the pattern exhibited in Marianne's case, spontaneous tissue death driven by apparent genetic factors, is extraordinarily rare. Some researchers have suggested she may have had an undiagnosed form of pyoderma gangrenosum, combined with immune dysfunction, creating a perfect storm of tissue destruction. Others point to possible mitochondrial disorders that prevented cells from maintaining normal functions. The truth is that with limited testing available in 1970 and no genetic sequencing technology, a definitive diagnosis was impossible. Today, with advanced genomic analysis, Researchers might be able to identify the specific mutations responsible, but Marianne's tissue samples were not preserved for future study, a common oversight in that era of medicine. What is certain is that her suffering was immense and unrelenting. Medical notes from her final months describe a young woman in constant pain, requiring increasing doses of morphine that provided only partial relief. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical. Nurses documented that Marianne would sometimes stare at her own arms and legs with an expression of incomprehension, as if unable to accept that this decomposing flesh was part of her. She occasionally asked why God was punishing her, what she had done to deserve this fate. There were no good answers then, and there are no satisfying answers now, only the cold biological reality that she had inherited a genetic hand so poor that survival was never truly possible. The impact on her family was devastating and permanent. Her siblings, all of whom carried some portion of the same genetic burden, lived with the fear that they might develop similar problems or pass them to their own children. Several chose not to have children at all, unwilling to risk perpetuating the genetic damage. Others moved far away and never spoke of their origins, creating new identities disconnected from Blackwater Hollow and its dark legacy. The community itself, exposed and studied by outsiders, felt violated and ashamed. Some residents blamed the Coulter family for bringing attention and judgment upon them all. Others recognized that but for slight variations in genetic chance, any of their families could have produced a child like Marianne. In the decades since Marianne's death, medical science has made tremendous strides in understanding genetic diseases. The Human Genome Project mapped the entire human genetic code. Technologies like CRISPR now offer potential for actually editing genes to correct mutations. Genetic disorders that were death sentences in Marianne's time can now sometimes be managed or even cured, but these advances have done little for the poorest and most isolated communities, where access to genetic testing and advanced medical care remains limited. In rural Appalachia today, there are still families dealing with genetic disorders at rates far above the national average, still communities where everyone is related, still children born with the accumulated weight of generations of consanguinity. The technology to prevent these tragedies exists, but the social and economic barriers to accessing it remain formidable. If you've watched until this point, it means this story has touched something within you, something that recognizes the importance of these hidden tragedies. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. And if you haven't already, hit that like button, because stories like Marianne's deserve to be remembered, not forgotten. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how isolation and lack of knowledge can destroy entire generations. Subscribe to this channel for more untold stories that reveal the hidden darkness in human history, the tragedies we must remember so they never happen again. Marianne Coulter's suffering was real, her pain was unimaginable, and her story is a stark reminder that knowledge and genetic diversity are not luxuries but necessities for human survival. Let her memory serve as a warning and a call to action, ensuring that no other young woman ever has to sweat rot while her heart still beats, that no other child pays with their flesh for the sins and ignorance of generations past.